Mason and I had been best friends since we were 6, and everyone in Harbor Creek knew we were in love except us. We met the summer his family moved into the blue house across the alley. My father sent me over with strawberries because new neighbors should feel welcome. Mason sat on the back steps, kicking gravel and looking miserable. I told him he could borrow my friends until he made his own. He said he didn't need help from a bossy girl, so I tipped the strawberries into his lap. He laughed, and after that we were almost impossible to separate. For the next 12 years, we built our lives around each other without discussing it. Mason waited every morning so we could walk to school together, even when his teammates teased him. I went to all his swim meets, including regional competitions 2 hours away. I drew his lane number on my wrist and shouted so loudly that an official once asked me to move away from the pool. People constantly asked whether we were dating. We always laughed. We weren't a couple. We were Mason and Claire. That felt safer than admitting we might want more. By high school, our friends stopped believing us. His teammates claimed he searched the bleachers for me before every race. My friends said I compared every boy to him. Mason and I insisted we were practically family. I knew he slept with the window open in winter and ate cereal from mixing bowls. He had seen me through braces and terrible homemade bangs. You didn't date the person who helped find your missing rabbit in 4th grade. College was the first thing that put real distance between us. Mason went to Northbridge University to study environmental engineering. I enrolled at Belmont College, 45 minutes away, for photography and media design. During the first month, I called him almost every night because my roommate played music until 3. When I caught the flu, Mason drove through a storm to leave soup, medicine, and a ridiculous stuffed penguin outside my door. He called when his project partner kept flirting with him, and he didn't know how to reject her without making the semester unbearable. I talked him through it while editing photographs in the library. To keep college from changing us, we made one rule: dinner together every Sunday. Sometimes we met halfway at a roadside cafe called The Lantern. The coffee tasted burned, and the fries were always cold, but it was the same distance from both campuses. Those Sundays became the fixed point of my week. Then, halfway through our 3rd year, Mason started dating Elena. She studied urban planning, wore bright red glasses, and was kind enough that I couldn't dislike her properly. For the first time, someone else had a claim on his time. Mason still came to Sunday dinner, but his phone stayed beside his plate. When I called after a professor tore apart my portfolio, he was at Elena's apartment and said he could only talk for a minute. I told myself this was normal, healthy even, so I started dating someone too.
His name was Owen, a film student from one of my classes. He was thoughtful, funny, and completely different from Mason. I liked him, but from the beginning I compared almost everything he did to someone else. The 4 of us went out together a few times. Those evenings were painful in a way nobody mentioned. Elena asked for stories about Mason and me as children, smiling like our friendship was a museum exhibit. Owen laughed at jokes he didn't understand and tried too hard to create new traditions. Mason and I became careful around each other. One familiar smile felt dishonest. Everything finally cracked during our last year. Elena was accepted into a graduate program in Vancouver and wanted Mason to move there after graduation. She told him it was time to stop arranging his future around childhood routines. Mason repeated her words during dinner at the Lantern. I knew the childhood routine she meant was me. I told him he should go. Vancouver had excellent engineering firms, Elena loved him, and staying behind because of an old friendship would be foolish. I smiled so convincingly that even I almost believed it. Mason watched me for several seconds. Okay, he said quietly. That answers it. I went back to my dorm and cried until my roommate, Tessa, sat beside my bed and refused to leave. 2 weeks later, Owen ended our relationship. He said he was tired of feeling like a guest in a story that had started long before him. I wanted to deny it, but he deserved more than another lie. I had spent years insisting Mason was only my best friend while measuring everyone against him. A few days before graduation, someone knocked on my apartment door at nearly 3 a.m. Mason stood outside in a wrinkled sweatshirt, sober and looking like he hadn't slept. He said he had ended things with Elena. She had asked him to choose between moving west with her and staying close to me, and he couldn't do it. I told him he was being ridiculous. He couldn't destroy a relationship and change his future because of me. That is the problem, he said. You keep saying because of you like you're only my friend. Before I understood what he meant, he kissed me. For 1 second, everything became still. Then I pulled away, shaking so badly I had to grip the doorframe. Mason looked terrified, but he didn't apologize. I asked whether he had really left Elena for me. He nodded. We sat on the front steps without touching. The street was empty, and my heart sounded impossibly loud. I wanted to kiss him again. I also wanted to run inside and return to the life where nothing had changed. Instead, I let him come in. We sat at opposite ends of the couch and talked until sunrise. Mason admitted he had loved me since high school when I skipped an exhibition to attend his championship meet after promising I would be there. He had called it friendship because I never gave him a reason to believe otherwise. Then it was my turn. I told him Owen had been right. I had loved someone else the entire time, and I had been too afraid to name him. Neither of us knew what happened next.
Tessa came home the next morning and found us asleep on opposite ends of the couch, fully dressed, with our feet nearly touching. She noticed Mason's shoes by the door and froze. "What happened?" I was half asleep when I said, "We kissed." Her scream made the upstairs neighbor pound on the floor. Tessa had spent 3 years predicting this. She made coffee and grinned while Mason and I avoided looking at each other. Then she asked when our first date was. That was when I realized we had not discussed what any of this meant. Mason left before graduation rehearsal. An hour later, he texted asking if I wanted to meet at a cafe near Belmont. He added, "actual date," in parentheses, which made my hands shake. We chose a place we had visited dozens of times, but seeing him waiting by the window made everything feel unfamiliar. I kept slipping into our old rhythm, talking about my final photography project and asking about his capstone presentation. Then I would remember we were supposed to be romantic and become painfully aware of where my hands were. I spilled my coffee across the table, twice. On the walk back, Mason reached for my hand. I let him take it. His fingers were warm and familiar, but holding them now felt like wearing someone else's coat. We had touched 1,000 times as children. This was different because we were noticing it. For the next week, we'd tried to act like a couple and failed in small ways. Mason brought flowers and immediately apologized because they seemed too formal. I tried to kiss him goodnight and bumped my forehead against his chin. We laughed, but beneath the laughter was fear. Then the future arrived. While studying at my apartment, Mason suggested I look for design work near Northbridge after graduation. He said it casually, as if the plan had already formed. Something inside me tightened. "I'm not Elena," I said. "I'm not rebuilding my life around whatever city you choose. I only meant we could stay close. But you already decided I'm the one who should move." He denied it, but we both heard the assumption beneath his words. Our first real fight happened with textbooks on the floor and graduation invitations on the counter. Mason called me unfair. I called him selfish. We were both terrified. He left without kissing me, and for the first time since we were 6, I watched him walk away without knowing when he would return. A week later, I received an offer from a creative agency in Briar City, nearly 3 hours from Harbor Creek. It was the kind of job I had dreamed about: editorial campaigns, gallery work, and real clients. Mason had 2 offers. One was near home, the other was in Briar City. When I told him about my job, he immediately said he would take the local position. He claimed he wanted to stay near his parents, but his expression told me something else. He was turning down another future because of me. I told him I needed him to choose for himself. He asked whether I even wanted us to work. "Yes," I said, "but not if you give things up and blame me later." Neither of us knew how to love each other without treating sacrifice like proof.
Mason's graduation party was held in his parents' backyard under strings of yellow lights. Everyone kept congratulating us as if we had completed some 16-year plan instead of stumbling into a relationship 2 weeks earlier. Near the kitchen, Mason's older sister, Evelyn, pulled me aside. "Are you sure this is what both of you want?" I became defensive, but Evelyn explained that Mason had been shaping his choices around mine since childhood. He quit music lessons when I complained they took up our Saturdays. He rejected a summer program because I was afraid of being alone. Now he was choosing a job he did not want because it kept him close. Her words followed me through the party. I watched Mason laugh with relatives and realized I had always treated his loyalty like something harmless. I never asked what it cost him. 2 months later, I moved to Briar City and started at the agency. Mason stayed in Harbor Creek and joined a small engineering company. He said the work was fine, but every weekend he looked more exhausted. He complained about repetitive projects and a manager who ignored every new idea. I listened, carrying a guilt I did not know how to admit. One night, while visiting him, I woke and found light coming from the living room. Mason was on the couch, scrolling through job postings in Seattle and Portland. He closed the laptop when he noticed me. "Do you regret staying?" I asked. He stared at the dark screen. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone." We stayed awake until morning, finally saying everything we had avoided. Mason admitted he felt trapped. I admitted I was terrified he would eventually blame me. We had turned love into a test where someone always had to sacrifice more. So we made a decision that scared both of us. Mason accepted a position in Ashford, 3 hours from Briar City. The work involved coastal restoration, something he had wanted to do for years. We agreed to try long distance instead of forcing one person to follow the other. The first month was miserable. We had spent most of our lives knowing where the other person was. Now every conversation required planning. Mason called during lunch while I was presenting to clients. I texted after midnight when he was asleep. Weekend visits disappeared beneath deadlines and train delays. Without meaning to, I began building a life that did not include him in every room. My coworkers invited me to gallery openings and late dinners. I joined a printmaking workshop on Wednesday nights because I hated going home to an empty apartment. My first prints were crooked, but for 2 hours, I thought only about paper and keeping my hands steady. I made friends who knew nothing about Mason. They knew me as Claire from the design team, the woman who ordered too much coffee and collected old movie posters. It felt like freedom and betrayal at the same time. Meanwhile, Mason sounded happier when he talked about work. His new team listened to him. He spent days inspecting wetlands and came home muddy, tired, and excited. I was proud of him. I was also beginning to understand that we could both be happier apart, and I did not know what that meant for us.
4 months into long distance, our conversations had become little more than reports. Mason told me which inspection site he had visited. I told him which client rejected a campaign. We asked whether the other had eaten and promised to talk properly on the weekend. Then the weekend arrived, and one of us was always too tired. One afternoon, my coworker Julian asked if I wanted coffee. We ended up walking through Briar City for nearly 2 hours, talking about photography, music, and a terrible mural near the river. When I returned home, I realized I had not thought about Mason once. That night he called. The conversation felt forced from the beginning. He described a meeting. I described a presentation. After we hung up, I stared at my phone and wondered when talking to my best friend had started feeling like another task on my calendar. I nearly texted that I missed him. Then I stopped because I did not know whether it was true. I threw myself deeper into my new life. The printmaking workshop became the best part of my week. There was a teacher named Mara who wore paint-covered overalls and reminded us not to fight the material. My first finished piece looked like a storm cloud trapped inside a square, but I loved it. I began visiting the weekend market with coworkers. I bought handmade cups, tiny paintings, and books I did not need. Slowly, my apartment filled with things I had chosen without thinking about whether Mason would like them. Julian invited me to a birthday party where I knew almost nobody. I spent an hour discussing old horror movies with his roommate and returned home surprised that I had enjoyed myself without checking my phone. Each new experience felt good, but guilt followed it. For most of my life, happiness had been something I saved to share with Mason. Laughing at jokes he had never heard or creating memories that did not include him felt strangely disloyal. I had spent years being one half of Mason and Claire. Now I was simply Claire. I could not decide whether that was growth or loss. Late one Tuesday, Mason called without warning. His voice was so broken that I could barely understand him. He said everything in Ashford looked fine from the outside. The job was good, his apartment was comfortable, his coworkers respected him. But he felt like he was disappearing. He admitted he had accepted the position partly because Ashford was close enough for weekend visits. Even when he tried to choose for himself, he was still measuring every decision by its distance from me. "I don't know what I want anymore," he said. "I only know how to stay close to you." I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed against my ear. What would you choose if I wasn't part of the decision? Silence stretched so long, I checked whether the call had ended. "I don't know," he finally whispered. "Wanting you has always been easier than wanting something for myself." His words hurt because I understood them. I had accepted the job in Briar City partly because it proved I could leave him. Mason had chosen Ashford partly because it allowed him to hold on. Neither of us had made a free choice. We were so afraid of losing each other that every decision had become another way of controlling the distance between us. After the call ended, I lay awake until morning. Loving someone was not supposed to mean putting your life on pause, but that was exactly what we had both done.
6 months after graduation, Mason and I ended our relationship through a video call. His face on my laptop looked pale and tired. I probably looked the same. For weeks, we had avoided saying what both of us already knew. Our calls became shorter, our silences longer, until we felt like strangers who remembered everything about each other. "Maybe we moved too quickly," Mason said. "We spent years being friends and assumed that meant we already knew how to be a couple." I agreed, even though the words felt like something tearing open inside me. We had skipped every step because of our history. We never learned how to date, how to disagree, or how to make separate decisions. We'd gone straight from childhood friendship to planning our lives around each other. Mason said he needed time to discover who he was without measuring himself against me. I needed the same thing. We agreed on a real break. No messages, no scheduled calls, and no checking each other's social media through mutual friends. Not the kind of separation where people still talk every night and pretend they are giving each other space. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat in silence. Then I started crying. I cried until my face hurt, and Tessa came into my room carrying water and tissues. I could not explain how losing Mason felt different from an ordinary breakup. He was not only the person I loved, he was part of nearly every memory I had. I'd spent more years with him than without him. Now I had to learn where he ended and I began. The first few weeks were unbearable. I reached for my phone whenever something funny happened. I nearly called him after a difficult meeting. Each time, I forced myself to stop. Gradually, the silence changed. I spent more time with my workshop friends. I created a small photography series for a local exhibition. I learned how to handle bad days without expecting Mason to rescue me. Some evenings were lonely, but they were mine. By Thanksgiving, we had not spoken for almost 3 months. I drove home to Harbor Creek dreading the entire visit. My mother prepared enough food for half the neighborhood and invited relatives I barely remembered. While we washed dishes, she casually mentioned that Mason was staying with his parents next door. My stomach dropped. For the rest of the evening, every car door outside made me look toward the window. His childhood bedroom light was on across the alley, and I hated how easily I became 17 again. I avoided going outside all Saturday. On Sunday morning, I made coffee before anyone else woke. When I looked through the kitchen window, Mason was sitting on the back steps of the blue house. He wore a dark jacket and stared at the empty alley. Then he looked up and saw me. Neither of us moved. He seemed different from the person I had watched through a screen, calmer, more certain. After a moment, he lifted one hand in a small wave. Before I could reconsider, I put on my coat and went outside. At first, we spoke carefully, like people meeting after a long absence. We discussed work, our families, and the weather. Then Mason mentioned that he had started seeing a therapist. He said therapy helped him understand that he had spent years confusing love with responsibility. He thought protecting me gave him purpose, so he ignored his own wants until he could no longer recognize them. I told him about the exhibition, my new friends, and the strange guilt I felt whenever I enjoyed life without him. For 4 hours, we talked on those steps like we had as children. Only this time, neither of us was pretending.
Mason told me he had spent the past 3 months learning to make decisions without imagining my reaction first. He joined a weekend hiking group. He started playing guitar again after abandoning it in middle school. He even admitted that he hated the apartment he had chosen in Ashford simply because it was close to the train station. I laughed, and for the first time that morning, the tension disappeared. I told him I had been afraid that enjoying my own life meant I no longer loved him. Every new friend and every evening spent without checking my phone had felt like evidence that we were drifting apart. Maybe we needed to drift, Mason said. Otherwise, we never would have learned how to stand alone. The sentence hurt, but it also felt true. We talked about the people we had become during the months apart. Mason described a restoration project his team had proposed for an abandoned stretch of coastline. I told him about the photo series one had submitted to a local gallery. The conversation felt familiar, but not automatic. We were listening, instead of assuming we already knew what the other person meant. Eventually, Mason pulled out his phone. He showed me an email offering him a position with an environmental consulting firm in Briar City. The company worked on projects he genuinely cared about, including flood prevention and urban wetlands. My chest tightened. Did you apply because I'm there? No. He answered so quickly that I believed him. Mason explained that he had applied a month earlier without telling anyone. He wanted to know whether he could choose the opportunity without using me as the reason. He planned to accept the job even if we never became part of each other's lives again. For the first time, hearing that did not frighten me. He was not following me. He was moving towards something he wanted, and that path happened to lead to my city. What does this mean for us? I asked. I don't know, he said, but maybe we don't have to decide everything today. That was new for both of us. We agreed to keep talking, slowly and honestly. No promises about forever. No pretending our history guaranteed anything. When Mason moved to Briar City in January, we would meet again and see whether two separate people could build something together. Our second first date happened at a small restaurant near my apartment. Mason arrived carrying a single yellow flower. He looked embarrassed by it, which made me laugh before he even sat down. The date was awkward in the best possible way. We asked questions we should have asked years earlier. What did he actually want from his career? What did I imagine my life looking like in 5 years? Which parts of ourselves were we unwilling to sacrifice? Sometimes we forgot it was a date and slipped into old stories. Then one of us would catch it, smile, and return to the present. When Mason walked me home, he stopped outside my building. Can I kiss you? The first time, he had kissed me because he was desperate and afraid of losing me. This time, he waited for my answer. Yes. The kiss was quiet and careful. There was no panic behind it and no expectation that it solved everything. For the next 6 months, we learned how difficult a healthy relationship could be. We kept separate apartments. Mason spent weekends with his hiking friends. I stayed committed to my workshop and gallery events. We planned dates instead of assuming every free evening belonged to the other person. It was harder than being inseparable. It was also the first time being together felt like a choice.
The progress was not smooth. In April, I made plans to attend a printmaking retreat with Mara and 2 people from the workshop. I had mentioned it weeks earlier, but Mason forgot and planned dinner for the same Saturday. When I reminded him, his face changed. So you're choosing them over me? The words landed harder than he intended. That is exactly the thinking that destroyed us before. Mason said he only wanted one evening together. I said he was turning every conflict into proof that I did not love him enough. Within minutes, we were shouting in my kitchen. He left without saying goodbye. For 3 days, neither of us called. I convinced myself we had learned nothing. Then Mason showed up outside my office holding 2 coffees. He apologized before I could speak. Therapy had helped him recognize the old fear beneath his anger. When I made plans without him, part of him believed I was building a life designed to exclude him. I admitted I had reacted too quickly because I feared any request from him would become another demand to surrender myself. We created rules that sounded embarrassingly practical. We would check our calendars before making assumptions. We could ask for time without treating no as rejection. Neither person had to prove love by canceling everything else. It was not romantic, but it worked. Slowly, we found a rhythm. We had date nights, evenings with separate friends, and quiet nights when we sat in the same apartment doing different things. Mason played guitar while I edited photographs. I went to markets with coworkers while he disappeared into the hills with his hiking group. Being close no longer required being identical. Near the end of summer, I found an envelope on my kitchen counter from Mason's company. Inside was an offer for a promotion at their Seattle office. The position included more responsibility, a larger team, and projects across the coast. The letter was dated almost 2 weeks earlier. When Mason arrived, I held it up. "How long were you planning to hide this?" He looked guilty. He said he had been trying to decide what he wanted before discussing it with me. At first, I was furious. Then I realized that, for once, he was not asking me to choose for him. We ordered takeout and sat on the floor. Mason explained that the promotion was impressive, but it would pull him away from the restoration work he loved. Seattle offered status. Briar City offered a team and a project that mattered to him. I told him I would miss him if he left, but I wanted him to choose what was right for his career. This time, I meant it. I was not testing him or trying to prove I was different from Elena. I loved him enough to accept that his best decision might take him somewhere else. Mason studied me for a long moment. Then he said he was declining the promotion. My stomach tightened until he continued, "Not because of you. I don't want that job." He wanted to finish the coastal project. He liked his team. He had finally built a life in Briar City that felt like his own. For the first time, I believed his choice belonged entirely to him.
2 years after our first kiss, Mason took me back to the Lantern. The cafe had not improved. The lights still flickered, the coffee still tasted burned, and the menu was covered in stains that looked older than we were. We kept returning because it belonged to a version of us that had survived everything. Mason barely touched his dinner. He dropped his fork, checked his pocket several times, and answered my questions with distracted half-sentences. I assumed something was wrong at work. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. "The first time I chose you," he said, "I didn't know how to choose myself." He told me that the past 2 years had taught him how to build a life that did not depend on keeping me close. He had work he cared about, friends who challenged him, and interests that belonged only to him. And somehow, he continued, the more I became my own person, the more certain I became that I wanted to share that person with you. He pulled a small ring box from his jacket. For several seconds, I could only stare. Then Mason asked me to marry him. I said yes before he finished the question. Not because we had known each other since childhood, not because everyone expected it, not because losing him frightened me. I said yes because neither of us needed the other to feel complete anymore. We could stand alone, and that made standing together feel honest. Wedding planning became an unexpected test of how much our lives had changed. The coordinator asked for a guest list, and I realized Mason and I now had entire groups of friends who barely knew each other. My workshop friends knew Mason as the quiet man who sometimes picked me up after class. His hiking friends knew me as the photographer who hated sleeping in tents. My coworkers had seen him at holiday parties, while some people from his engineering team had never met me. Years earlier, that would have scared me. Now it made me proud. We had built separate lives instead of shrinking into one shared identity. There were still difficult moments. Mason came home angry after a project proposal was rejected, and I listened without trying to solve it for him. I received a harsh review of my exhibition, and he held me while I cried, without acting as though my disappointment belonged to him too. We supported each other without becoming responsible for every feeling. Sometimes that balance felt less romantic than the version of love I had imagined as a teenager. It required conversations, boundaries, calendars, and apologies. It was also more real. A month before the wedding, we returned to Harbor Creek to help our families prepare. Mason and I sat on the steps behind the blue house where we had first met. "I can't believe you dumped strawberries on me," he said. "You deserved it. You offered me your friends and attacked me 30 seconds later. You called me bossy. You were bossy." I leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment, we were 6 years old again. But we were not those children anymore. We had spent years believing love meant never separating. Then we learned that sometimes people must step apart to understand whether they are choosing each other or simply afraid to let go. Mason looked toward my parents' house across the alley. "Do you ever wish we had done it differently?" I thought about the breakup, the lonely months, and every painful conversation. "No," I said. "I wish it had hurt less, but I don't think we would be ready for this without it." He squeezed my hand. Neither of us needed to promise that nothing would ever change. We already knew change was the reason we had made it this far. The wedding morning arrived with heavy rain. For weeks, the forecast had promised clear skies, but by sunrise, water was running down the windows of the old greenhouse where we planned to hold the ceremony. The coordinator rushed around moving chairs, my mother worried about everyone's shoes, and Tessa kept insisting that rain was lucky. Strangely, I was calm. Years earlier, I would have treated every problem like evidence that something was going wrong. Now I understood that a difficult moment did not automatically mean a bad ending. Mason sent me one message before the ceremony: "Still choosing you." I smiled and wrote back, "Still choosing myself too." Then, after a moment, "That's why I can choose you." By the time the guests arrived, the rain had softened. Drops tapped against the glass roof while candles reflected in the windows. Our families filled the front rows, followed by people from every separate part of our lives. My co-workers sat beside Mason's engineering team. Mara and my workshop friends compared handmade jewelry with members of his hiking group. Tessa cried before the music even began. When I walked toward Mason, he looked nervous, but not frightened. There was a difference. Fear had shaped so many of our earlier decisions. It made us hold on too tightly, sacrifice things nobody had asked us to surrender, and confuse dependence with devotion. Now Mason stood waiting for me as someone who knew he could survive alone, and I walked toward him knowing the same thing about myself. During the reception, Evelyn gave a speech. She talked about watching us grow up across the alley and how everyone had assumed our story would be simple. They were best friends, she said, so we all thought becoming a couple would be the easy part. The room laughed. But they had to learn that knowing someone for years isn't the same as knowing how to love them well. They had to stop being afraid of separate lives before they could build one together. Mason looked at me across the table. Evelyn raised her glass and said our relationship had survived not because we never left each other, but because we finally learned how to return as whole people. Later, Mason and I danced beneath the greenhouse lights. His hand rested against my back, steady and familiar. Around us, our friends and families talked, laughed, and moved between tables. The rain had stopped, but water still covered the glass above us. I thought about the boy sitting alone on the steps of the blue house. I thought about cold fries at the lantern, long-distance calls, the breakup that felt like losing part of my body, and the morning we found each other again. For years, I believed our history was what made us belong together. I had been wrong. History only brought us to the same place. It did not teach us how to stay there. We had to learn that ourselves. We had to become people with separate dreams, separate friendships, and separate reasons to wake up each morning. We had to stop expecting love to answer every question or heal every disappointment. Only then could we choose a shared future without disappearing inside it. Mason leaned closer and asked what I was thinking about. That you were right when we were 6. About what? Girls are trouble. He laughed, pulling me closer. And you still owe me strawberries. I think marrying you makes us even. Not even close. We kept dancing while the lights reflected above us. We had taken the difficult road, the one filled with distance, mistakes, and painful honesty. But standing there with him, I finally understood that love was not about finding someone you could not live without. It was about building a life you were proud of, and freely inviting someone to share it. Mason and I did not choose each other because we were incomplete alone. We chose each other because we had finally become whole.